I guess we're ready.
Yay, go Tom, we love you. It's your birthday.
Oh, hello. This is the last talk of track 2, believe it or not. And me being a noob, I got the last talk of the track. New to the security market anyway. So I'm Tom Ruff. A little bit about me. First off, big thank you to FireEye for sponsoring my trip to SkyDogCon 5. Yay, FireEye. A little more about me. My first computer was a Commodore VIC-20. I had to mow about 21 yards to pay for it back in the mid-'80s. As I started in the software world, I was a system administrator for Sun OS. Who knows what that's called now? Solaris. UTS, which was Unix on a mainframe, and obviously Linux. As I progressed, I moved into software development. I started using KNRC. Anybody know KNRC? No? Kernighan and Ritchie? Nobody? I'm old. I did some assembly on System 390. Did the hardware assist code that emulates instructions because IBM would add a new instruction to the instruction set. We didn't have time to redo the chips because that took about 3.5 months when you changed the CPUs. So we would write code to emulate what that new instruction was supposed to do. So I did that for a while. Then I moved into Java and web development. And then at some point along the way, I realized that security was lacking and needed more focus. So that's a little bit about me. The disclaimer, and I'm going to do this a little more visually. So today I was trying to decide what shirt to wear for this, but the opinions in this talk do not represent FireEye in any way, shape, or form, so I couldn't wear my FireEye shirt. They do not reflect the opinion of SkyDogCon, so I'm not wearing my staff shirt. So I went with something I like, Snoopy. And it tells the truth at the bottom, so we're all good. So as it goes on, if something bothers you, if you don't like my political views, please feel free to go to track 1. There's somebody talking over there too. All right, short agenda. Have a quick introduction, and then we broke it up into 2 topics. You don't know what you don't know, and how can you beat human nature? Then we'll wrap it up, and we'll have any questions. Along the way, there are 6 trivia questions. If you can answer any of them correctly, you will be rewarded with something that I'm pretty sure you'll like. All right. Introduction. All of us who are now in security or have been in security for a while, we look at some of these vulnerabilities that come across into CVEs or whatever, and we think, how in the world could a developer be dumb enough, I didn't write that there, to let that happen? I would like to suggest through this talk that those things happen in a very similar way to poor governmental decisions at the federal level. I didn't pick on any states. I stick at the federal level. So if we look at the past few years, published vulnerabilities, they just keep going up. 4,150, 5,278. Statistically, that's pretty well level. And then it goes up again by almost 50% in 2014. So since I spent a lot of time looking at the Linux kernel, draw a little perspective here. In 2011, the Linux kernel was 13.5 million lines of code, predominantly in C. As that has risen to 18 million lines of code over the past 4 years, the number of vulnerabilities reported, they weren't all Linux vulnerabilities, obviously, but the number's gone up significantly. So the first thing I want to talk about is cost. So what is the cost? So we will pick on my the language that I've written for the longest amount of time professionally, Java. Java originated in the 1990s, created by James Gosling, a member of Sun Microsystems. They created what was called the Java Virtual Machine. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Java Virtual Machine, it sits on top of the operating system and interprets instructions that are written so that you can run it on any platform. One of the big things when Java first came out, developers used to always complain about memory management. Have to allocate some memory, I got to do something with it, then I got to throw it away. Then I got to allocate some more memory, do something with it, and throw it away. Java was touted to free developers from the heartaches of memory management with something called a garbage collector, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. It was also touted as write it once, use it everywhere. So you could write it one time, you could run it on Linux, Windows. I did actually do some coding for a while in OS2. Anybody know OS2? Yes, I'm old. Which we do now call Windows, sort of, yeah. OS2 was a co-founded project between IBM and Microsoft. IBM was the primary piece of it. Microsoft contributed to it, and then Microsoft put it out of business. Initially, it was an interpreted language, so that means you were not compiling it to machine code. You actually compiled Java programs to a .class, but it was just a representation that then had to be interpreted by the virtual machine before it got ran. So we'll compare the cost part of it in a minute, but I would like to compare that to Obamacare. Obamacare originated in the first term of President Barack Obama. Healthcare insurance issued or provided by the federal government in one way or another provides a cure to what they were calling the healthcare epidemic. All these people who didn't have insurance. Touted as buy it once, use it everywhere. So anybody who needed it could use it. Promised to lower your healthcare costs because then you don't have the people in the healthcare industry having to go chase people down when they didn't have insurance for thousands and thousands of dollars where they end up writing it off 20 years later. Originally available in 2014, and the initial interpretation was that individuals could keep their existing coverage without penalty. So, trivia question number 1. Whose opinion is not expressed in the next slide? Yours. No, that wasn't what I said. Anybody? SkyDogCon. Who said SkyDogCon? Catch.
Hotel Preston, am I right? It was Hotel Preston.
Hotel Preston,
Wasn't it
FireEye, and SkyDogCon.
Oh, okay, right. He already got the other. Yes.
So all he needed was one. So,
Okay.
all right. So, as we call it.
You guys shouldn't answer any tricky questions.
I'll put a little more arc on it this time. I forgot to allow the height of the stage. Short guys like me, we're not used to being up high. So let's talk about Java for a second. I said it was interpreted, which means every instruction had to be converted from the language it was in, which is Java bytecode, and ran inside the virtual machine as native code. So when Java first came out, Java 1.0, 1.1, the interpreted Java cost was about 16 to 20 times the CPU of a comparable native application. Even if I wrote it in something awful like Pascal, it still took about 16 to 20 times the CPU in Java than it would in Pascal. Numbers were even a little better than that in C. So it was like 20 to 24 times. Until Java 7, every Java core class was loaded as soon as you started up the JVM. The JVM didn't know what you needed. It didn't look at the code. It was interpreted. It was reading it as it goes, like a script. So every Java class that you put in your class path was getting loaded. So even to just do a simple hello world on a console, it took at least 200K of RAM. My first computer that we were talking about a little while ago only had 16K. So that's a huge difference. And I was writing entire games, text-based games. But just to say hello world, it took 200K. So in like kindness, if we look at Obamacare, The massive undertaking of getting the Obamacare brokerage site online was months late, primarily blamed on contractors, and it had numerous security vulnerabilities. I know you've all seen them. On top of that, adding to the individual's cost, those people who did have really nice insurance policies from wonderful employers like FireEye are now being charged a luxury tax because our insurance is better than what Obamacare is. You'll see it as a line item on your W-2 at the end of the year. So, costs you extra money. Continuing along that same line of thought, to remove the burden of memory management, the Java garbage collector goes around and he looks for stuff that's no longer being used. All the way up until Java 6, which was 12 years after Java came out, every time the garbage collector had to run, the entire process had to stop. So it would come around, he'd start running low on memory, he'd say, stop, hold up. Then he would go around, collect all the old pointers, free up that memory, and then you'd start all over again. So for those of us doing near real-time development, or those of you doing websites, your website just stops long enough for it to do the cleanup, and you'd see these unexpected pauses in your application that you had no explanation for. So along that same lines, as the different versions of Java came out, 1.2, 1.4, Java 5, they kept adding all these extra tweaks to the garbage collector to try to make it better. I have literally been paid thousands and thousands of dollars doing nothing but tuning the Java garbage collector, trying to make those pauses that you run into smaller, playing with the heap size, playing with the increment of how far does it let the memory get full before it runs. They also added a sweep mechanism that would actually catch some of the local variables and free those up without having to stop the JVM. But still, even in Java 8, which has been out for just a few months, if you push the memory far enough, you have a stop the world. Everything just holds, and I got to go free up some space so I can keep running. Comparing that again to Obamacare, signups for Obamacare were stopped until some of the security vulnerabilities were. Grab a quick sip of water here. Were fixed. And just as a side note, parts of the application for the Obamacare site were written in Java, but I haven't had a chance to look at it, and it's too soon to tell if the site will actually get better. It's slow, it's bulky, it's expensive, and just wasn't very well done. So my last comparison here, even though that developers have now been freed from memory management, leaks still happen. You create a variable in a much larger scope than you're supposed to, a global variable or a static variable that gets allocated as soon as the program starts running. The resource leaks still happen. We have applications at FireEye that run for a while, and you just see the memory creep up, and then the operations team has to come back and say, hey, restart service, and then you start back down here again, and over time it just creeps up. So it's still a problem, even though Java promised to fix it. With that, I would like to say in Java's defense, now that Evan's not here, that most of the security vulnerabilities are found are with the JVM itself or with the application that was written. It's not against the language itself. The language itself doesn't have any built-in vulnerabilities. On the Obamacare side, to kind of match that up, almost every company, health insurance company now has a plan that fits under Obamacare. and they're really hard to tell them apart, yet you can get charged from low to high. It's worse than buying a car. It really is. So now, trivia question number 2. For those of you who might have been around Java for a while, what is the name of the graphics toolkit in Java 1.0 and 1.1? And I'll give you a hint, it's not something that couples do. Anybody? Nothing? Come on, Sarah, bail me out.
You're old. I can't. What am I gonna do? Sorry.
Java 1.0 was 1998.
I was born in '83. I wasn't paying attention yet. It's not ponies.
No.
Not ponies. I'm sorry.
The second Java windowing toolkit, also known as the abstract windowing toolkit, was the first one, and it was replaced by something called Java Swing. Not something that couples do.
Oh, yes, they do.
So.
I don't know what couples do that involves ponies or doesn't involve ponies. That one didn't go over.
Okay, so I'll save that one. So whoever answers the last trivia question right gets 2. Okay, moving on. Summary. Java was created with good intentions. Obamacare was created with good intentions for the most part. Java was created to make it easier to develop software for many platforms. If you go to Java 1, which I've been to 3 times, you'll see it blasted everywhere. Java on 1 billion devices worldwide. And it's true, it runs on phones, it runs on microwaves, it runs on Blu-ray players, PCs, Macs, servers, you name it, you can find Java for it if you really want to run it. Whether or not you do is up to you, but it is available. On the other side, Obamacare was created to help some people provide health insurance for those who couldn't afford it or couldn't get it because they worked 3 part-time jobs instead of a full-time job. But on both sides, the true cost of it was hidden. Java created new extreme demands on RAM and CPU. 200K to say hello world. Cranking up a JBoss web server takes at least 6 gigs of RAM. CPU-wise, single core, not an option anymore. So it's increased it greatly. From the federal budget point of view, Obamacare is already way over projected costs in the first 2 years. But in both of these cases, adoption's been widespread. As I said, Java on 1 billion devices, and 16.4 million Americans are currently enrolled in Obamacare. So, from the previous slides, I had at the top, the truth will set you free. So, trivia question number 3, which WWE superstar uses the catchphrase, "The truth will set you free"? Anybody?
Sorry.
Catch. Oh, she stood up. So that happens to be my sister's favorite WWE superstar, so I had to put it in the talk.
Yay.
So the next one, where did this go wrong? How can you beat human nature? So before I go to this next slide, I'm going to say that I am currently a certified Scrum Master, planning on renewing it next month. So when I say this, it's from experience. Agile Development. As we were going through the 90s, when I was first starting to become a professional programmer, many Agile development methodologies came together. We'll talk about some of those in a little bit. As we crossed over into the new millennium, the Agile Manifesto laid out an ideal environment for doing programming as far as the developers were concerned. Over a dozen different Agile methodologies have been published. As I said, I'm a certified Scrum Master. So there's lots of certifications out there available, like there's certifications in security. This idea of Agile development redefined the relationship between project managers, stakeholders, and developers. And it gave the development team more control over the development of the software. We can talk about if that's good or bad in a few minutes. I want to compare that to the New Deal. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was created to combat the Great Depression in 1933, and that was well before I was born. Before you say it. Unemployment had reached 25% at that point. They created 14 programs over a 4-year period with far-reaching effects that included subsidizing farmers, created a national retirement fund, also known as Social Security, unemployment insurance, and it actually increased the power of unions, and I'll talk about that in a second. So, trivia question number 4. Name 2 Agile development methodologies represented in the Agile Alliance, which is when the Agile Manifesto was created.
Scrum.
There's one.
Kanban.
There you go.
Yay.
I'm not going to pitch it over your computer,
Yeah,
so
thank you.
I'll put it right here.
Yay. Thank you. Let's see, I think it is.
So if you wanted to know the whole list, you had extreme programming, Scrum, DSDM, adaptive software development, Crystal, feature-driven development, pragmatic programming, all came together at this conference that lasted 3 days, and they came up with the Agile Manifesto. And again, it was a group of strictly developers and philosophers. There wasn't a whole lot of interaction from other groups. And it really did change the development world. So, the world will never, and to quote, ever be the same again. So, Agile development. It was all focused around developers. It really was. It promises paced, reliable software development. No more spending 72 hours at the office straight trying to get a release out the door because it has to go out on September 30th. No more a management philosophy that I'm very familiar with, but not at FireEye, called burn them and turn them. You just run the developers as hard as you can. When they burn out, they quit, they go somewhere else, you hire new ones. Another promise of Agile development was to remove some of the overhead from traditional project management. But what really happened is you ended up replacing that overhead from the project management with layers and layers of rework and technical debt. And then, to quote a former president, except he changed the third word here, what is done? The definition of done is the most struggling, troublesome part of Agile development. For those of you who have been around it, a developer thinks software is done when he can compile it on his machine. I've been there. If you ask someone who actually has to use it, it's when it works and it doesn't lock up my machine every 5 minutes. And it's completely different. If you ask a security professional, done is when it works, it doesn't lock my machine up every 5 minutes, and Evan can't hack into it in 5 minutes. So, again, if we compare that to the New Deal completely changed the role of the federal government in individual lives. During the Great Depression, President Hoover had encouraged America to stand pat, stay tall, and be patient. Rely on yourself. The addition of the New Deal, the federal government assumed responsibility for taking care of individual people. So that was a huge game changer in the United States. Also, as a side note, Social Security and unemployment insurance added a new revenue stream that Congress could borrow money from. Since 1934, 16% of the United States national debt is money that they have borrowed from Social Security. So they took a piece of paper and said, we owe Social Security this many dollars that we're going to have to pay to people over time. They stick it in a drawer. They took that money and they spent it on something, whether it was building warships, investigating outer space, building power plants, whatever they used it for. The money is now gone and owed back into Social Security. And it's a multi-trillion-dollar deficit right now, so that's a lot of money. And then the most conflicting part of Agile is what is done. The most conflicting part of the New Deal is, what's your motivation to stop taking these benefits once you start getting them? Simple answer, there's not one. And until that enigma has been solved, there's going to be issues. So, trivia question number 5. Just kidding, the real one. Which Chris Jericho is more kissable? The 80s hair Jericho or the short hair Jericho?
Trick question. You made out with all of them.
I have not. No guesses? I mean, there's only 2 choices.
I'm currently kind of like digging on. I'm really torn. I mean, if he wasn't wearing shiny things, I'd like long hair one better. But I'll go with the short hair nerd boy any day. So.
You lose.
What?
So dreamy.
Nobody? Who wants the bottle? I'm not going to throw it. I'll just put it on the stage.
Say you're gonna throw it at them?
Whoever wants it, we'll put that one out there. So let's summarize what I've talked about here. Again, Agile Development was created with good intentions, but it was also created with a very narrow focus. The focus was to give the developers what they wanted to do. There was no consideration for deadlines. There was no consideration for project management. There was very little consideration for business. It was touted as to remove the heavy bonds put on developers by traditional project management such as waterfall. For those of you who aren't familiar with waterfall, I'll take a moment here and talk about it. So the idea with waterfall is you go out, you gather all your requirements, you figure out what you're going to build, you sit down, and then you build it. And nothing changes. Your requirements are what they are. They stay static until you complete it. And then after you get to 1.0 release, then you go out and gather some more requirements. Any changes that you wanted to make, anything that changed during your development life cycle. And then you take all those and you start all over again, and it just cascades from revision 1 to 1.1 to 1.2. And that has been touted by Scrum and other methodologies as it simply takes too long. By the time you get all your requirements gathered, all the requirements that you gathered before have already changed. And by the time you get it built, it's changed again. So they go through an iterative process of get the important information and then get details about a small piece of it, build that small piece, and then reevaluate. It's a great idea when it's executed properly. But unfortunately, it's not being executed very well in all the environments that I've been in so far. I've seen it in the federal government. I've seen it in 3 different commercial companies. I've consulted with developers on 2 different continents, Europe and North America. And in every situation, it's just not being done real well. They've given the keys to the prisoners. The prisoners are running the prisoners are running the prison at this point. So there's a long way to go. And in just a moment, I'll talk about why. But the New Deal, it was created to bring the U.S. out of the Great Depression. It was marginally successful. If you go back and you study it closely, what really brought the United States out of the Great Depression was the bombing of Pearl Harbor, because then we actually had a reason to go pour a ton of money into building warships, building planes, building ammunition, gearing up our men to go fight a fight that it's debatable whether we would have been drug into or not. So go down to the next 2 points down there. The New Deal relied on the fact that people want to work and improve. If we had stuck with what President Hoover had suggested, if he had gotten reelected, there would be no unemployment insurance, there would be no Social Security. If you didn't take care of yourself, nobody would take care of you, which is how this country started. Once the New Deal was in, people started not being as strongly willed to take care of themselves. This community, I would say, is an exception. But for the most part, when you go out on the street and walk by 100 people, there's probably one who's as motivated as the people in this room. And that leaves a problem. Goes back to what I had before. What is the motivation to stop taking it once you start taking it? We don't have any. For Agile Development to be successful, the entire team, and you've got to redefine what a team is in Agile. They want multifunctional, an entire team who can build a project all working together. So your testers, your security people, the developers, the product owner, they all need to work as one, and they need to have a goal, and they have to be motivated to do it. One of the biggest problems in Agile Development is now the developers have complete control, and there's no repercussions for the fact that they miss a deadline. They yank 50 features out of a build that were promised. So without solid controls from the beginning, both can cost much more than predicted. And speaking of cost, my sixth and final trivia question, which is worth not one, but 2 bottles. What percentage of people in the United States received some sort of welfare benefits in 2014? And we'll round it to the nearest 5. So if you get within 5, I'll give it to you.
Nearly 50%.
You're not within 5%, unfortunately. 40, you are within 5%. So these are yours. Just a shade over 35%, 35.4% of the people in this country received some sort of welfare benefits in 2014.
Can you define that, like in terms of some sort of welfare benefits? Are we talking about SSDI? Are we talking about WIC? Are we talking about
All of them combined.
Okay.
So, but I did not put Social Security into that because Social Security is something that, whether you like it or not, 8% of your check, 7%, whichever one it is pulled out. Half from you, half from your employer, the full 8% if you're self-employed. And you have to pay it. If you don't, go to jail. And then you don't get to make any more money. So that's a huge number. To think that in 60 years, almost 70 years, we went from the programs not existing to more than 1/3 of the people in this country being on those kind of benefits is shocking. And if you look across the industry, every shop says they're ditching waterfall, they're ditching PMI, and I've been close to getting my PMI certification at one point in my career, I must sadly admit. they're changing to Agile, but they're not putting controls over it. And without that, you either have to have a really, really focused, really, really motivated team, which is hard to get sometimes, and a cohesive team that'll work together. It's not going to work for you. So I have hopes that these things will change, but I wouldn't promise it in the near future. So with that, I will open up to see if there's any questions.
So definition of done, right? It's evil. Like I recently was at a company that has folded largely because of issues in the development process. Like definition of done didn't happen, so no product happened. You know, it's just one of those things. What if you found culturally to work when you're trying to create the culture of, you know, yes, we're going to check something into this release, and no, we're not adding anything else, no, we're not pulling anything else, and we're accountable for our code, and what that definition of done is.
Wow, you just gave me an entire talk.
Right?
If I was talking at Java 1 or an Agile methodology course, I could literally spend hours on this. So we'll take it piece by piece. So controlling your build really starts with building a good track record with your product stakeholders. If you deliver what you're going to say you're going to deliver to your stakeholders on a regular basis, they're not going to mess with your schedule unless they absolutely have to. If you can come out day one and say, I'm going to deliver this piece of software and it's going to work, and then I'm going to deliver another piece of the software that's going to work, and you do it time after time after time, they're going to know that at the end of that cycle, whether it's waterfall or Agile, that they can make their adjustments and then wait one more cycle and it'll be there. If you consistently miss your deadlines, then they're going to consistently mess with your schedule more often. It's just like when you're dealing with a teenager. I have 2 of them at home. If they're consistently late to school, you're going to make them get up earlier. You're going to change their schedule. You're going to make them go to bed earlier. If they're consistently late turning in their homework, you're going to want to check their homework every day at 8:30 p.m. And I've done this from time to time. So the way to keep your stakeholders out of your hair is to deliver what you say you're going to deliver. Even if it's not what they're asking for right at that moment, they'll understand. They can come back and get another iteration of it. Definition of done. That has to start at an organizational level. The software will work. It will not be bloated. It will not require 17 cores in a laptop for it to actually run worth anything. It will have documentation, something that I've had to get over multiple times with multiple groups. Putting security in day one, when you first start looking at the architecture. I'm a secure... Well, have an architecture. That's the start too. But I'm a GAC certified Java secure programmer, which I have to renew next summer, hint, hint, to somebody who's sitting in the next to the last row. The idea is make done actually done. Done doesn't mean that the developer is tired of coding it or they actually got it to build for the first time. Done really has to be something usable. One of the best analogies I've talked about in other talks that, in different settings is that a mechanic working on a car. He calls you up and says your car's done. You go over there, there's no tires on it. It's not done yeah, you finished fixing the carburetor or the fuel injectors or whatever, but I can't drive it. Then he calls you back later and says it's done, and there's no battery in it. So then I got to go back home, wait for him to get a battery delivered, put it in. Well, along the way, they had to change the ignition switch, so the next time I go back, my keys don't work. So you really need to set out a very simple but direct way of saying, for my software to be done, it must compile, it must execute as defined in the functional specs, it must have documentation that a fourth grader can understand. Just JavaDoc dump out of what's in the code is not sufficient to give to end users. Security architect must have looked at it, given it a once-over. At one point in my career, I spent over 2 years, 50 developers that were working on various websites for a major health insurance company in the Southeast. None of their code went to production if myself or my partner didn't look at it. Nothing. We were looking for resource leaks. We were looking for security issues. We were looking for plain text passwords in the configuration files, which is maddening that I still see that in 2015. So you lay out these simple things and say it will not be considered done until it meets these 8 criteria or whatever it takes. And then you hold them to it. And if the team works together, steps up and delivers time after time, then it'll get better. Let's see, there was one more piece of your question.
Oh gosh. That was a lot. And I think we've covered it. Like the definition done thing is like my biggest thing. Is, you know, it's like I watched something really cool just not get anywhere because we didn't, you know, so the negotiation stuff you're talking about and the actually having a definition done, because they kept saying they were done. Like, you know how that
A
is.
big part of it that I found, and from having worked with Tom for a number of years and seeing a lot of the inputs that have gone into some of the parting of this talk, is the product owner, like the idea in Agile is that you have a product owner who is not on the development team. And that oftentimes is, at least in the way it's implemented, they'll try to separate it from like what you would traditionally have as project management. Well, project management is not the product owner. It's not the person that's responsible that consumes its output. Is I guess the way that I should define it, or should clarify that. Like, who is consuming the output and who is
The real one.
yeah, who is responsible for delivering that to the customers. And so, you know, the person that has to stand there and be held accountable in front of the customers for that product, that is the person that influences what the definition of done is and what the inputs to complete in the first place are. You know, I think what I've seen a lot of Agile teams get wrapped up in is that they have to start with something like building the core or the back end of it, and then that becomes, and so for the first couple of development cycles, like, no, Mr. Product Owner, no, you know, whoever's, you know, asking for, you know, defining requirements, we can't meet your requirements until we build some base of something, and then for some reason a year later that base of something is like just become this big spaghetti monster and none of those other things have gotten developed, you know, and it's just like, whoa, at what point does, we're not here to sacrifice the concept of the project for you to like go build, you know, catch that beautiful butterfly, and I think that's, so that would be one of those first stumbling blocks that I've seen is like, oh, well, I'm going to build the back end of the data architecture, and then, you know, 3 iterations or 3 agile iterations later, you still don't have, you know, a table that represents the data that you want to load into it. That's probably a time for a product owner to start to shut down, start to squash some hopes and dreams.
And if you compare that to the new deal that I was talking about earlier, there were no boundaries set on it. We were just, the plan was to dump a bunch of money into the economy and watch what happens. There were no limitations set on it. There were no.
I would argue that quite a bit because there was quite a bit that was going on. Confiscating gold for the process of actually increasing the value of stuff.
which was then taken down. But
Okay, so I'm gonna ask a really stupid question, and I'm not trolling. Okay, I promise you. I'm not
Okay.
trolling. I tend to be more of the tax the rich and fund the social justice programs kind of girl. I mean, food stamps, it's time limited. You can only have food stamps as long as you qualify, and you have to recert. Like, SSDI, I'm assuming you have to recert. I don't know. So I could be wrong there.
you do every 4 years.
Okay, so we're doing some due diligence there. WIC, I don't think anyone should have an issue with, frankly, feeding kids is just smart. Like, I'm not, I mean, this is my judgments and I apologize for that, but like, they do actually do some control on these benefits. Like, I've had to look
The-
at them for people. It's not easy to get them either.
The control was put in afterwards,
Sure.
which is the same thing as trying to put security in afterwards when an application is built. It doesn't work. It just doesn't work. So the idea behind what was being done was good, but it also relied on some ideals that it changed in this country.
Okay.
It relied on the fact that nobody wanted to stay on welfare for 3 generations, which happens in this country. It relied on the fact that people wanted to make a difference. And the same thing with Agile Development. It relies on the fact that you have a mature team who, when they commit to doing something, even if they have to miss Monday Night Raw a couple of times when they're staying at work late coding, will get it done. And there's a portion of our community and there's a portion of this country that does that, but there's a portion that doesn't. And that's the hard part. I'm not saying get rid of it. I'm just saying it changed the way that people think about it. If you look back at software development in the early 90s, when I started coding, you were given a hard set of requirements and you had to meet them. Now the development team is developing on 19 different languages if they feel like it, whichever one is the coffee of the day or the special of the week or however you want to phrase it. And they define what goes to the user. So much more so than they did 20 years ago. It's hard to believe I've been developing software almost that long. But the same way that the New Deal changed our view of the federal government. If you look at the federal government 100 years ago, the federal government was there to give you the opportunity to make the best you could. And then the New Deal changed that view to the federal government there is to catch you if you can't do what you expect to do. And in the years since the New Deal, the view has become it's the government's responsibility to take care of me. And that's a problem. And unfortunately, I see some of the changes in the software development community going a very similar route. 20 years ago, you had to meet the requirements. And I know I'm running short on time.
Oh, you're fine. You've got 8 minutes.
But as it's going now, it's we get to tell you what you need and how you need it, and then being the developers, and then at some point, I think it could change to the point where they expect that whatever they deliver will be accepted.
They do.
I mean, we do know this word Microsoft. Whatever they throw at you, they expect you to spend the money on to upgrade.
They've gotten so much better. I mean, sorry.
But
Define the definition of better.
Nicer about it?
Somewhere around done.
Yeah.
Well, I like mine medium rare. How about you?
I'm a well done kind of guy. I always have been. Whether it's burgers, steaks, or my software development, it's got to be well done. All right. Just a quick list of references. These are all the different sites that I took a look at to gather information. They'll be on the slides that get posted to the website. And in closing, a quick thank you. Obviously, thank you to SkyDogCon for giving me my first opportunity to speak at a con. Thanks to Pen Test Fail for riding my back until I actually got this talk done and encouraging me to talk. And thank you to FireEye for giving me the opportunity to fly here instead of driving 10 hours. My Twitter handle's up there. It'll be on the website. And thank you. Please go have a drink and find something much more chipper than my talk.
Your face, Evan.